Good morning, everyone.
In unison, good morning.
In unison, good morning, Your Honor.
Call your next witness, please.
We would call Maria Gomez back to the stand, please.
All right, come forward to the witness stand. You're still under oath, so when you get to the witness stand, you may be seated.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
Okay, Miss Gomez, we've called you back to the stand to ask you more questions. First of all, did you participate in a test of the bells at Neverland outside Mr. Jackson's private suite?
Yes.
And first of all, remind us how long you've worked out there at Neverland.
I have worked there nearly 11 years.
And when was the first time you went down that hallway and heard the bells go off?
When the first time was.
Sure. About how many months or years ago was that when you first heard those bells go off?
Oh, many years ago.
Okay, and it would have been before February of 2003, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and has the, excuse me 1 second. At the time you did this alarm test, or this, let me withdraw that, I'm sorry. At the time you did this test with Mr. Nimmer where you walked in and out, do you remember that?
Yes, that was about, I don't know exactly, but just a few days ago.
Okay, sometime this year, correct?
Yes.
When you heard the bells at that time, is that what the bells have always sounded like over the last few years?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd like to have permission to play the Exhibit 5096. It's the short one, if that's all right.
All right.
I can't find the remote control. Do you see it? Oh, here it is. Thank you. Miss Gomez, we're going to play 5096 and I'm just going to ask you to watch it and see if you recognize yourself in there and recognize what was going on, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about it after it's over, okay?
Fine. Whereupon, a portion of a DVD, Defendant's Exhibit 5096, was played for the court and jury.
With the court's permission, I'm going to stop it after the first test to ask some questions.
All right.
Okay, Miss Gomez, you recognize yourself in that film?
Yes.
All right, and you remember Mr. Nimmer, the man who was shooting this?
Yes.
What were you asked to do in that particular test?
I was supposed to walk outside to a hallway that's right in front of the house, and that I should walk all the way into the room, passing by the doors. I had to punch in the code and then I could open the door.
Okay, so when you went out, you went all the way down the hallway to the end of the hallway that's near the front door, is that right?
Yes. Outside of the house, yes.
All right, so did you actually go out of the hallway into the front door area?
Yes.
Now, do you know anything about the technology of how this alarm system is set up?
No, I don't know anything about that.
Is there some point when you're walking down the hall that it makes the bell ring?
Yes, when you reach about halfway down the hallway, it begins to ring.
All right, and then it continues to ring for a number of rings, is that right?
It will stop for a few moments and then when you arrive at the door, I don't know if it's stepping into the lift or, it begins again.
All right, now, the sound that you heard on that tape, is that the sound of the alarm that you have heard for the last few years?
Yes.
Are there any changes to it that you know of?
No.
All right, I'm going to resume playing this, if it's all right, Your Honor.
Yes. Whereupon, a portion of a DVD, Defendant's Exhibit 5096, was played for the court and jury.
Let me just pause it right there. There's a door down at the bottom of the stairway there.
Yes.
All right, and the door appears to be open right now, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, did you do a test where you left that door open?
Once.
Okay, and then the second time you closed the door, is that right?
When I went out, I closed it.
All right, and I'm going to resume playing. Whereupon, a portion of a DVD, Defendant's Exhibit 5096, was played for the court and jury. Okay, I'm going to pause it right there on the blank screen. And for that test, you went down the stairs, correct?
Yes.
You went out the door, we could see, at the bottom of the stairs?
Yes.
And then you went out the main door to Mr. Jackson's suite?
Yes, it's all in the same process. I went all the way out.
So then you went all the way down the hall, out the end of the hall, turned around and walked back. Is that right?
Yes.
Alright, and you could hear the bell in that tape, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and that's the same bell that you've heard for years, is that right?
It's the same bell.
Alright, okay, and then we'll resume, if we may. Whereupon, a portion of a DVD, Defendant's Exhibit 5096, was played for the court and jury. Alright, thank you. On that last test, you did the very same thing that you did the time before except you closed the door at the bottom, is that right?
Yes, that's the only different thing.
Alright, and let me ask you, did you do this a whole bunch of times or did you just do it these 3 times?
I did it, not very many times, but.
So I'm talking about when they filmed it. Did Mr. Nimmer film it more than 3 times or he just had you do the 3 tests and he filmed what you did?
He filmed it, well, the first one he did it once, the first time. And then the other times, like when I went up to the room, since he did 2 different tests, perhaps he taped more than one.
Okay, so he did the first one, the second one and the third one?
Yes. Yes.
Alright, okay, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How many times did you go up and down the stairs?
I cannot recall, but at that I did do more. 3 or 4 times.
So we saw 2 times on the film, correct?
Yes.
But there were other times that did not appear on the film?
Maybe 1 or 2 times, I believe.
In each time you walked out of the doors of the room, you walked all the way to the end of the hallway, correct?
Yes.
And then you turned around, you went through the doors, correct?
Yes.
And you turned around and came right back, correct?
Yes.
So in each of the occasions that we saw on the film, you did exactly the same thing?
In the first test, I just got to the point and then returned. And then when I went up the stairs to the room, I waited. I counted to about 15 and then I repeated the process. I came back.
And where was it that you counted to 15?
In front of the main doorway.
So you go all the way out, count to 15, and then come back?
Yes.
The chimes that go off, you can hear them when you go through the first door to begin your route down the hallway, correct?
What do you mean, when you're just about to go in?
Okay. You're outside of the hallway to Mr. Jackson's room, near the entrance of the front door of the house, correct?
I am inside the house by the doorway to the main residence.
Correct. And you're going to go through the first set of doors heading towards Mr. Jackson's bedroom?
Yes.
And when you go through those doors the bells, the chimes, go off, correct?
When you reach about halfway down the hall.
And then they stop, well, and then the second set of chimes goes off right before you get to Mr. Jackson's door to his bedroom?
When you go in the doorway, the door to his room, then they begin to sound.
For the second time?
Yes. I don't know if it's because you're standing by the lift or when you press the code or what it is.
Now, during the time of February and March of 2003, were you responsible for cleaning Mr. Jackson's room?
No.
During February and March of 2003, did you go into Mr. Jackson's room for any reason?
No.
Were you at work the day that the sheriff's deputies came to the ranch and executed the search warrant?
Yes.
And that was November of 2003, correct?
Yes.
And at that time were you responsible for cleaning Mr. Jackson's room?
No.
Had you gone into Mr. Jackson's room during 2003 at all?
No.
In 2004, the next year, okay?
Yes.
Were you responsible for cleaning Mr. Jackson's room at that time?
I have never been in that position.
And during 2004, did you ever go into Mr. Jackson's bedroom?
Perhaps.
Do you remember? Let's go back to 2003. Do you remember during 2003 whether both of those chimes were working?
Yes.
And if you didn't go into Mr. Jackson's bedroom during that time, what were you doing going down the hallway?
Objection. Argumentative as phrased.
Overruled. You may answer.
Could you repeat that again?
Yes. You told the jury that during 2003, you did not go into Mr. Jackson's bedroom.
Yes.
And I'm asking you, if you did not go into his bedroom, why would you be in the hallway leading to his bedroom?
There is a bathroom in that hallway.
Okay.
And that hallway is our responsibility to clean. And then when one is walking in that hallway, you will hear the chimes.
Okay. That's what I wanted to get to. Now, during 2003 you did clean that bathroom, correct?
Yes.
And when you do that, the alarm only goes off once, correct, when you go through the first set of doors.
Objection. Misstates the evidence and compound.
Overruled.
It rings. I don't know. It will ring and then it stops.
During 2003, in November, when the sheriff's deputies came to Mr. Jackson's ranch, is it your testimony that the alarm through the first set of doors was working?
Yes.
And in December of 2004, do you recall sheriff's deputies coming back to Mr. Jackson's main residence on another occasion?
Yes.
And you were there?
Yes.
And is it your testimony that the chimes at the first set of doors were working during December of 2004?
Yes.
All right, nothing further.
I believe you said that the alarm goes off the first time when you're just about the middle of the hallway. Is that correct?
Yes.
And this is a hallway that has a lot of stuff in it, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and you need to dust and clean in there, is that correct?
Yes, we are responsible for that place.
Alright, so aside from the bathroom that's off that hallway, you need to go down the hallway to Mr. Jackson's door and dust and do things, right?
Yes.
So the alarm that we heard is the same alarm that you've heard for years in that hallway, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and you were just asked by Mr. Nimmer to help him by walking, right?
Yes.
This was not your idea to be in this, was it?
Oh, no.
Alright, Your Honor, what I'd like to do is play Exhibit 345, which is already in evidence, and this was the people's version of the alarm that they taped on November 18, 2003.
All right.
If I may play that. I'm going to play that in 1 second, and when I do, I'm simply going to ask that you watch this and then, I'll play this one all the way through. It's very short, and when we get through playing it, then I'll ask you a few questions about it, okay? And I don't believe you were there at the time, so I'm just going to ask you to watch it. Whereupon, a DVD, Plaintiff's Exhibit 345, was played for the court and jury. Okay, now, that's a very short film there, and we don't know exactly where the cameraman was on that picture. Did you hear a bell in that?
Yes.
Was that the first bell or the second bell? Do you know?
The second bell.
Alright, so the first bell would have already gone off from somebody going through the middle of the hallway?
Object. Calls for a conclusion and speculation as to that point in time.
Sustained.
Alright, did you hear the bell that goes off when you go through the middle of the hallway in that tape?
I wasn't present at that time.
Okay, alright, okay, I have no further questions.
No questions, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. You may step down. Call your next witness.
Can I just have 1 second, Your Honor? Off-the-record discussion held at counsel table.
May we approach, Your Honor?
Yes. Discussion held off the record at sidebar.
Alright, my apologies, Your Honor. As the court knows, we're all getting down to the end here, so we've got a few details to work out. We would call Mr. Radakovich, whose name I probably mispronounced. I apologize in advance.
Come forward, please. When you get to the witness stand, please remain standing. Face the clerk over here. Raise your right hand.
Yes, I do.
Please be seated. State and spell your name for the record.
My name is Mike Radakovich. Radakovich.
Thank you.
Okay, I did mispronounce your name, but you weren't in the room so you didn't hear it. Mr. Radakovich, what do you do for a living?
I'm a certified public accountant.
How long have you done that?
Around 30 years.
Alright, and where do you have your office?
In San Luis Obispo, California.
And do you work in this area, in the Santa Maria area as well?
Yes, I've testified both in Santa Maria and San Luis Obispo County.
In addition to doing forensic work, which is testifying in court, do you do ordinary CPA type duties?
Yes, I do.
Alright, I'm going to. Maybe I should have this marked first, Your Honor, as defense next in order. I'm going to ask that a chart, an analysis chart, be marked, and my guess is that would be 5105. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'm going to show you 5105 for identification and ask you if you prepared that chart?
Yes, I did.
And did you prepare that chart after reviewing certain documents?
Yes, I did.
Alright, now, I'm going to show you what's been marked for identification as 5097, which appears to be a Washington Mutual Bank statement, and also 5098, which appears to be a Washington Mutual Bank copy of a cashier's check. May I approach for that purpose?
Can I see that?
Yeah. Okay, now I'm showing you those two documents. And for the record, Your Honor, those have been retrieved from subpoenaed documents from Washington National Bank. I believe counsels indicated they have no objection to the foundation as being subpoenaed business records.
That's correct.
Okay, were those two of the documents that you looked at in the course of preparing your analysis sheet?
Yes, it was.
Now, on your analysis sheet, there are two entries at the very beginning that indicate date and source, and the source on those first two entries are Louise Palanker, and the amounts on those two entries are $10,000 apiece. Do you see those?
That is correct.
And you reviewed copies of those checks, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
And you put those on your analysis sheet, correct?
Correct. Those are two checks. One was written to Ms. Janet Arvizo and one was to Mr. David Arvizo.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to statements being read from this report and
Can't hear you, sir.
I'm going to object to statements being read into the record from this report, as well as referencing this document as an analysis before there is some foundation laid as to its admissibility on the basis of hearsay, authentication and relevance.
I don't think I asked him, Your Honor, to read from the report. I just asked him if he made an entry as to two checks.
I believe counsel has already read the first two entries to the witness.
So I think your objection is that the items are not in evidence yet?
They're not in evidence and no foundation has been laid.
Your Honor, I believe they are in evidence. I believe these were admitted in evidence by the prosecution some time ago.
What number?
I'm not referring to the items. I'm referring to this document that counsel is reading from. My foundation and hearsay.
That's the question. What I need to know is, are they in evidence?
The two Palanker checks are in evidence, Your Honor. And I know you're going to ask me the number and I don't have the number off the top of my head.
That's all right. Do both sides agree they're in evidence?
Yes, I believe those two documents are in evidence, those two checks.
Your objection is overruled.
So now we go down to, before we go down there, as to those two checks, did you simply record, from the information on the checks, the date, the source, the amount, and a brief description?
Yes, sir.
Alright, now we're going to go down to the next lines and we'll try to take these all at once. They would be the next 5 lines. And those appear to be references to deposits in the Washington Mutual account.
Yes, those are the same deposits that appear on this bank statement that you handed me, exhibit number 5097, as being deposits into that Washington Mutual account.
So 5097 appears to be a bank statement, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that bank statement is from what bank?
Washington Mutual Bank.
And who is the account holder?
The name at the top of the statement is Janet Arvizo, FBO Gavin Anton Arvizo.
What does FBO mean?
My understanding, that's for the benefit of.
That's an account that Janet Arvizo. Under ordinary banking practices, Janet Arvizo would have the ability to sign on and she is putting it in the form that it's for the benefit of somebody else. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Alright, now, from that exhibit, 50, which exhibit was that? 5097?
The bank statement is 5097, yes.
Yeah, from 5097, did you record the date of the various deposits?
Yes, sir. Those appear in the column headed, Date.
And then we'll skip source for a second. Under amount, you indicated the amounts that were deposited into the account. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then you have, under description, deposit into that particular bank account number, Janet Arvizo, FBO Gavin Anton Arvizo, correct?
Yes, sir.
Alright, now, the source says, fundraiser. Were you asked to assume that there had been testimony in this case that monies were deposited in that account from fundraisers?
Yes, that was my assumption.
Okay, so between that assumption and what you saw on Exhibit 5097, the next 5 entries would be correct. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to object to foundation as to the source and assumptions made by the witness regarding specific sources for these 5 deposits. I don't think there's been any testimony concerning those specific deposits and the sources.
Your Honor?
Yes.
There was testimony that this account was set up by Janet Arvizo, that she had set up an account and she admitted on cross-examination that the money had gone in and she had withdrawn it all. So this is an expert witness, although his expertise for the purposes of this is very limited, but he's an expert witness who's being asked to simply organize these facts. And I asked him to assume hypothetically that there had been proof that this money came from a fundraiser, which is consistent with prior testimony.
And that is a matter of contention.
As to whether it came from the prior testimony or not.
Yes, and the specific source for these deposits on these individual dates.
Well, I'll allow the witness to make that assumption. To the jury, it goes back to an instruction I gave you a long time ago. It seems now, about hypothetical questions. Remember that? It was a short instruction. But basically it tells you that when a hypothetical question is proposed to a witness or propounded to a witness, the jury, the fact finder, still has to determine whether or not the underlying hypotheticals are proven or not, when you consider this witness's testimony. So I'll just remind you of that instruction, and allow the attorney to proceed with this line, making it clear that you're, use the word, hypothetical, if you would, so that the jury understands that, and then based on that, I'll overrule the prosecution's objection.
Alright, so other than the characterization of fundraiser on those next 5 lines, the rest you simply recorded from the documents, from the Washington Mutual records, correct?
That is correct.
Alright, now, I'm going to show you 5099 for identification. If I may approach, Your Honor.
You may.
5099 is a copy of a check, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And, Your Honor, that also comes from the materials that were business records that were subpoenaed, and there's a stipulation as to the foundation. As to 5099, did you record on the next line of your analysis the date that that check was written?
I recorded the date it was deposited. It was actually written on November 2nd.
Alright, and it was deposited November 5th?
Yes, sir.
And that was 2001, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
The source is Michael Adler?
Yes, Michael Adler.
And it looks like it says, Alder, here.
It is. It's hard to read a copy of the copy, but I think it is Alder. ALDER.
And then the amount is $32,308, is that correct?
Yes.
And that amount was deposited in that same account, is that correct?
That's correct.
Alright, now, there's a notation, J.C. Penney lawsuit. Do you see that under description?
Yes, that's under the description, J.C. Penney lawsuit. On the check itself it says, under memo, Arvizo settlement.
Alright, and were you asked to assume that there had been testimony, for the purpose of a hypothetical for the entry of this material on your analysis, that there had been testimony that the settlement source was a J.C. Penney lawsuit?
Yes, sir.
Alright, now, I'm going to ask you to look at 5098, which is a document dated November 9, 2001. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what does that appear to represent?
About 4 days after the $32,000 is deposited, Ms. Arvizo withdraws $29,000 from the same account, and it's made into a money order payable to Hollywood Ford.
Alright, now, could you determine that on November 9, 2001, Janet Arvizo withdrew $29,000, approximately, from her Washington Mutual bank account?
I see that same amount clearing the bank after this check is drawn.
Alright, so you determined that from the Washington Mutual Bank account records, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Alright, and then the actual document that you have in front of you is what appears to be a copy of a cashier's check. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, do you know if that cashier's check actually was cashed by Hollywood Ford?
I do not know where it was cashed. I do know that there's a withdrawal from the bank around that time for $29,000.
Alright, and is there any indication that $29,000 went back into the account?
I never saw it go back into the account.
Alright, now, the next line under the analysis is December 2001.
Yes, sir.
Is that correct? Were you asked for the purpose of preparing this analysis to assume that Asha Pryor had testified in this court that she had given $600 to Janet Arvizo in December of 2001?
That's the assumption that I've made, yes.
And, okay, and I'm sorry. I couldn't help overhearing Mr. Sneddon, so I apologize, but it was a stage whisper. Whether it's cash or a cashier's check, were you asked to assume that money was given to Asha Pryor?
I assumed money was given to Asha Pryor.
You assumed that because you were asked to assume that, for the purpose of preparing this, correct?
Yes, sir.
Alright, now, we're going to skip. No, we aren't. We're going to go from January 2nd through March 17th, and I'm going to show you a series of checks, and these checks are numbers 5100 through 5104. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm showing you 5100 through 5104. Those are documents that came from the bank records that have been subpoenaed of J. Jackson, and I'm going to ask you if you reviewed those for the purpose of preparing this analysis?
Yes, I did. They are listed on my schedule.
And is the information listed on the schedule the information that comes directly off of all of those checks?
Yes, sir.
Could we have the actual exhibit numbers traced to the individual exhibits?
Sure. So 5100 would be the January 2nd welfare check of $769. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And that was deposited into J. Jackson's Bank of America account. Is that correct?
Yes, it was.
And then 5101 was the same date, January 2nd, 2003, and that's a check from J. Jackson to Raymond Trujillo, rent for Soto Street apartment.
That is correct.
And then 5102 is a February 24th welfare check for $769, and that was deposited in J. Jackson's Bank of America account?
Actually, the check is February 15th. I think it was deposited February 24th.
Okay, so the date of the check is the 15th, deposited February 24th?
That is correct.
Alright, and there's a notation that apparently somebody switched the numbers around at the bank, and they had to correct that error?
Yeah, being an accountant, it's not unusual to transpose numbers. And when it was first deposited, it was deposited as $796, and the bank caught that. And so when it shows up as a deposit on his bank deposit as $796, and Bank of America catches it and takes $27 back out of the account.
Alright, so the bottom line, aside from all that accounting business within the bank, the bottom line is the welfare check of $769 was deposited into J. Jackson's Bank of America account, correct?
That is correct.
And the next one is 5103, and that's a check from J. Jackson of $425, a rent payment to Raymond Trujillo for the Soto Street apartment. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And the last one, 5104, appears to be a welfare check. Is that correct?
Yes, dated March 17, 2003.
And that's for $769?
Yes, it is.
And that appears to have been cashed by Janet Arvizo?
It's hard to read, but it looks like it's her signature.
Alright, okay, Your Honor, we would move into evidence 5097 through 5104, which are those documents as exhibit records from the various accounts.
No objection.
They're admitted.
Now, looking at your analysis for the moment, or back to that, the last 5 entries are entries for which you did not have specific documentation. Is that correct?
Correct. Except for the February 6th through March 12th, I did review what I referred to as exhibits 414 and 416.
Alright, well, let's start with that. Did you have an occasion to look at court exhibits 414 and 416?
Yes, sir.
And what did those appear to be?
They appeared to be expense. I guess you'd call them expense reports that showed various expenses being made, and the notation on those was for Janet Arvizo.
Alright, and whose bank account? What was the name? I'm sorry, let me withdraw that. What was the name of the entity for which this expense report was prepared?
It was my understanding it was Neverland Valley Entertainment.
Alright, now, were you able to come up with a precise number as to how much money had been expended on behalf of Janet Arvizo or her children as opposed to expended indirectly on her behalf in some other fashion?
No, I was not, but it appeared to be several $1,000s.
Alright, and were you asked to assume for the purpose of preparing this chart that there was testimony in this court indicating that several $1,000s had been spent on behalf of Janet Arvizo and her children during this period of time?
Yes.
Alright, so under the amount, rather than putting an exact dollar amount, you just put several $1,000s, right?
That's correct.
Was your purpose to come up with a bottom line that was going to be computed?
No.
It was just to record these various transactions so we'd have them all in one place, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Alright, and then February, the next line is February 5th to February 24th, 2003. And this says, source, Michael Jackson. Were you asked to assume, for the purpose of preparing this, that there had been testimony that money had been expended on behalf of Janet Arvizo and her children for a trip to Miami, body wax, children's braces, lodging, travel, food expenses and so on?
Yes, sir.
You indicated in the amount column several $1,000s, correct?
Yes, sir.
Once again, did you have any ability to do an accounting as to what Mr. Jackson expended on behalf of these particular individuals?
No, sir.
Okay, alright, and then I see there's actually maybe a typo here. The next line is February 7th to March 12th, 2003. There's an indication, several $1,000s, living expenses at Neverland Ranch.
Yes, sir.
Alright, and it says, for some reason, MJ Sounds, and I have no idea why it says, sounds, there. Why don't we just strike that word out?
That's fine.
Were you asked to assume there had been testimony that this family had been living at the Neverland Ranch? The previous one was living elsewhere and other expenses for them, but this line being living expenses while they're at Neverland Ranch?
That is correct.
Alright, and again, you didn't know how much, so you put several $1,000s, is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, the next line is February 20th, 2003, and you indicated Hamid Moslehi, and the total amount of $2,000, and description, cash. Were you asked to assume that there was testimony in this trial that Hamid Moslehi had given Janet Arvizo $2,000 in cash on February 20th?
Yes, I was.
And were you asked to assume whether that was a loan or a gift or anything else, or just that it was $2,000?
I assumed that he received $2,000, or the Arvizo family received $2,000 from that gentleman.
Alright, and then the last entry is November 2nd to present. It says, source is J. Jackson. Amount is unknown. Were you asked to assume that there had been testimony from Gavin and from J. Jackson that Janet Arvizo had been living with J. Jackson off and on from November 2002 to the present?
That is correct.
And so you've indicated there would be some sort of lodging and use of an automobile based on the assumptions that we asked you to make, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Alright, based on all of that, is this chart now a fair and accurate depiction of what you have just testified to? That is, the documents you received and looked at, and also the assumptions you were asked to make from the prior testimony?
That is correct.
Your Honor, I would move into evidence exhibit 5105.
I'd object to the admission of that evidence, Your Honor. I'd like to take the witness on voir dire.
Microphone's off again, sir.
I won't rule on the admissibility until after your cross-examination.
All right.
I was going to request to publish it so I could just show it to the jury, but I'll hold off, if that's all right, if I would be allowed to do that after Mr. Auchincloss concludes his cross, assuming it's admitted.
I'm going to hold off on the ruling until he examines. We could do it by voir dire or cross, but I think it's better just to do it by cross.
With that exception, I would like to put this up if it's admitted later. I'll defer to Mr. Auchincloss.
All right.
Good morning, Mr. Radakovich.
Yes, sir.
Did I pronounce that correctly?
Perfectly.
Alright, I'm looking at Exhibit 5105 and I'm going to go through that with you somewhat quickly, but I want to focus on the items for which you do not have any evidence before you. There's several things you were asked to assume in this document and I want to talk about those. First of all, beginning at the top of this document, you have a June 15, 2000, entry from Louise Palanker, $10,000, check to Janet Arvizo. Have you seen that check, first of all?
Yes, I have.
Do you know if Janet Arvizo actually personally received, that $10,000?
I saw a signature that appeared to be her signature on the back of it, cashing it. I don't know what happened to the funds.
Okay, how about the check to David Arvizo, the next entry, July 10th? Can you tell us whether or not Janet Arvizo actually received that $10,000?
The check was made out to David Arvizo.
Okay.
And it looked, I've never seen his signature before to compare, because that was the only document that his signature was on, but it looked like he cashed it.
Okay, but you have no evidence to lead you to believe or conclude that Janet Arvizo received that $10,000.
No, sir.
Now, what were you specifically asked to do in preparing this document, Exhibit 5105?
Well, to look at particular transactions, and to basically list the pieces of information from those documents in the order that shows up on the schedule.
Was the idea here to create a list of income that Janet Arvizo received between the dates of, let's say, June 15, 2000, and I guess March 12, 2003, over those 3 years?
Not to list any income, just to show the transactions.
Okay, just to show a list of transactions?
That is correct.
Was there any guidance as far as what transactions you were going to put in this list?
I was provided, I'm going to call it a book of evidence, an evidence book, that had various checks. Some of which are in evidence here, additional ones that I don't know if they're in evidence or not in evidence as those checks from Louise Palanker. I was given those documents.
You were given a book of documents?
Yes, sir.
Who gave you the book of documents?
Actually, it was delivered to my office, but it's my understanding it came from either Mr. Sanger's or Mr. Mesereau's office.
Do you have that book with you today?
Yes, I do.
May I approach and take a look at that item, Your Honor?
Yes.
Alright, thank you. So when you received this book, I noticed that, well, is it fair to say that the book has some additional documents in it apart from what you've included in your report on Exhibit 5105?
Yes, sir.
And did you receive some guidance from Mr. Sanger or anybody else as to which documents were going to be selected out of that book to be included in this exhibit?
Yes, we met and discussed the documents in the book and which ones Mr. Sanger wanted to have on the schedule and which ones had the actual documentation behind them.
Okay.
There were a lot of documents in the book.
So Mr. Sanger told you what he wanted on this list?
We had a meeting and we discussed various transactions. And I suppose, yes, he told me which transactions to put on the book, but it was a discussion that him and I had back and forth. We discussed various transactions.
But many of these transactions you don't even have in that book. Is that fair to say? You don't have any evidence of the transaction in the book that was delivered to you?
Just the ones that Mr. Sanger brought up at the end from February 6th on. There aren't any indications of those in this book.
And you also don't have any indication of the transaction involving Asha Pryor in December of 2001?
I'm sorry, that one also. There's no indication for that.
And some of this information in this report you don't have any knowledge of except based upon what Mr. Sanger told you. Is that fair to say?
I don't quite understand what you're asking.
Well, for instance, the source of the deposits to Janet Arvizo's account at Washington Mutual. You have no idea what the source of those deposits was?
No, and I don't think I'm trying to, under description, I just say, deposit into the Washington Mutual account. I'm not making any kind of opinion as to where I think those sources are coming from.
But the source you wrote in this document as fundraiser, 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 fundraiser for those 5 documents. And you don't know that the source of those funds on those entries was, in fact, a fundraiser except for what Mr. Sanger told you. Is that fair to say?
Yes, as he indicated, that was an assumption that was made.
Okay, so moving down the list, you assumed that each of those deposits came from a fundraiser, but you don't have any knowledge of that?
That is correct.
Moving to the next entry, November 5, 2001, there's a check from Michael Alder. It says, J.C. Penney lawsuit. Did Mr. Sanger ask you to assume that as well?
Yes, and there was. Also, I reviewed a J.C. Penney lawsuit settlement statement.
And then moving down to the next one, that's a cashier's check from Hollywood Ford. Do you have any information as to whether or not that check to Hollywood check was cashed?
Actually, it's a check to Hollywood Ford, not from.
I misspoke. A check to Hollywood Ford. Do you have any idea whether that check was ever cashed?
I have no idea.
Do you have any idea where those funds went?
The check is made out to Hollywood Ford. I assume it went to Hollywood Ford.
But that's all you have had. Does that check cashed? Does it indicate it's been cashed based upon the markings on the check?
Well, what we have is a copy of a cashier's check. So we don't have the actual check itself. The check would have not been returned to Miss Arvizo. It would have been returned to the bank. When you get a cashier's check, it doesn't come back in the mail with your bank statement. It's returned to the bank.
Okay. Did you call Hollywood Ford?
No, sir.
So you really don't know if Hollywood Ford received that check, true?
All I can say is it was made out to Hollywood Ford.
Do you have any idea whether the $32,000, $32,308, do you have any idea whether those funds went to Janet Arvizo or if she shared those with her husband or if they went to somebody else? Do you have any idea where those funds went ultimately?
Yes, I do. They went to the Washington Mutual account and they were deposited into the Washington Mutual account, the $32,000.
Yes.
And about 7 or 8 days later, the funds were basically cleared out when she wrote a check to Hollywood Ford. Basically, money comes into the bank and the money goes out to Hollywood Ford.
So with the exception of the $3,000, approximately $3,000?
That is correct.
Okay, but we're back to my previous question. You don't know what happened to that $29,000, exactly where those funds went.
Well, it went to Hollywood Ford. I guess I'm.
You have a cashier's check, but you said you didn't have an indication whether or not that check was cashed, true?
No, the funds were withdrawn from the bank. I know that.
Yes.
The funds were withdrawn from the bank. There is a check on that same day for the same amount to Hollywood Ford. It's not unreasonable to think that that check went to Hollywood Ford.
Gotcha. But that's an assumption that you're making, correct? You don't have any direct evidence that that check was cashed at Hollywood Ford, true?
Well, the check was made out to Hollywood Ford, the funds left the bank. I guess I'm assuming that, but I guess I assumed the sun came up this morning, too.
Well, let me throw another assumption at you.
Let's assume we're going to take a break. Laughter.